Good morning, and happy fall to you. Today's the first full official day of the fall. I know some of you don't want the fall to come, but it's here. Excuse me. All right. Well, let me pray with you and we'll get started. Gracious God, thank you for these students and for their love for you. Thank you for their desire to learn and grow. And we pray today that all the things that have brought them here and all the opportunities that they have here, they would take advantage of, and that they would have a great experience here. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Oh, my bad. There we go. Yeah, there's the groan. We're talking about Title IX. Sorry about that. Um, but not really. I wish I could say that things that we are going to talk about related to Title IX never happen here, but they happen everywhere. We live in a fallen world, which means not only do we sin against other people, but other people sin against us. And sometimes that sin comes in the form of unbelievable betrayal. Sometimes that sin comes in the form of humiliating circumstances and situations. Sometimes that sin comes in the form of discrimination, bullying, all those kinds of things that are the topic of our discussion this morning. As you probably know, maybe you haven't noticed it, but there are certain environments where taking advantage of others is prevalent and common. And obviously schools is the first on the list. Any place where there is authority, there is somebody who can be sinful and take advantage of that authority for their own pleasure and to the harm of another person. We live in a sinful world. And so, as a result, Clarksville University is committed to your safety and your protection, and that you would learn how to treat other people. Not saying you don't personally, but that everyone would learn how to treat others with respect. That we would do what the Bible says, right? That we would do unto others as we would have them do unto us. So that's the context. But you look around in our world today, and every other day there's another story about a pastor, a babysitter, a school teacher, something happens at a camp, there's a coach, there's a marching band. Maybe you don't read those stories, but I do, and so it's happening all the time in our culture. And Title IX is a law that is trying to do what we ought to do anyway, and that is protect one another. So, no person on the basis of sex, 1972. That's where the law began. Shall deny participation, benefit in, be subject to discrimination, those kinds of things as it relates to your educational experience. You deserve the kind of educational experience that everyone deserves. And that's a right, according to the government. And so anytime that right is violated, it is a civil rights violation, Title IX. So discrimination is a part of that, and any kind of sexual violence is a part of that, sexual harassment is a part of that, relationship violence, stalking, hazing, all those things come under that umbrella of things that can prevent you from having the kind of experience that the government believes you have the right to have, and we believe you ought to have. So sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, um, and it includes requests for sexual favors. It includes unwelcome sexual advances, other nonverbal and verbal physical contact of a sexual nature. It is a form of sexual harassment. The word is unwelcome, and I just have to park there for a second and say, any of you at any time, if someone makes you feel uncomfortable, you ought to let them know that whatever they're doing is unwelcome. That's something you can do to help yourself, because you're firing a warning shot. You're putting them on notice that that kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Okay? That's the part, one of the parts that you can play. I wish I didn't have to say that, but what happens is, you get to a place where there's some sort of proceeding or some sort of hearing or some sort of investigation, and the individual may claim, well, this person wanted this behavior. So it's really helpful if a person is clear about what they want and what they don't want. If someone stepped on your toe repeatedly, you'd say, hey, stop stepping on my foot, right? If someone kept walking in front of you as you were trying to walk down the sidewalk, if you're from New York City, you would say, I'm walking here, right? So just letting people know is really helpful. Title IX talks about behaviors that are severe, pervasive, objectionable, offensive. Those are the big words, and have the effect of discriminating or intimidating, and that can be as an employee, so as a student worker, as well as a student. It can come in the form of, this is verbal harassment, jokes, innuendos, comments, questions, derogatory comments about one's gender or gender identity or sexual orientation, sexual stereotypes, unwelcome sexual advances, all these kinds of things. And I have to say this because when you leave this place and go out into the world in which we live, these things apply. And in the workplace, these things are important. So this is career ready, right? You can't create, or if you can't experience, if you're the person who's experiencing it, you're not supposed to experience a hostile environment. And sexual harassment has two major areas. And one is this hostile environment type of harassment. That's based on a person's gender, and it's verbal or nonverbal physical contact that has a purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with that person's work or academic performance, or creates a humiliating, degrading, intimidating, hostile work environment, educational or living environment. You see that word humiliating? There's one term I haven't talked about, that's hazing. Hazing falls under that category. Even if a person volunteers to be hazed, the activity is still against the law. It's against our code of conduct. So initiation into some sort of group is still something that can be used because of the amount of peer pressure. People subject themselves to things that later on they deeply regret, and sometimes they experience physical, mental, emotional harm. It's not fun. And a lot, just have to say this, a lot gets done in the name of just having fun. That's not just fun. A lot gets done in the name of just joking around. That's not really joking around. You guys and girls are adults, and there are things that adults just can't do. The other form of sexual harassment is what's called quid pro quo. That's when someone says, you do this for me, and I'll do this for you. Or because I have this information about you that you don't want to be made public, now you're obligated to do these things for me. That's against the law. So when not participating in an activity, especially of a sexual nature, with someone or for someone, because of something that they have on you, some power they have over you, some authority they have over you, some control they have over your grades or your playing time or your opportunities, those kinds of things would be quid pro quo harassment. Sorry about that. It has visual implications, so displaying or posting objectionable information, unwanted touching, physical harassment, unwanted touching, physical contact, sexual assault, rape, all those kinds of things are also prohibited. And retaliating if someone should make a report, if someone should file a complaint, and there's retaliation in any way, shape, or form, that is also a Title IX violation. It's against the law to retaliate. It's kind of the same thing that I've just said. The statistics are staggering. 25% of women, 6% of men have reported that they've experienced an attempt or accomplished rape during their college years. Athletes are 4 times as likely as non-athletes to be victims of sexual assault. 25% of college women were assaulted during their college years. 50% of college students experienced dating violence while in college. 13% of women were stalked while in college. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're being stalked, male or female, know that that's something that is protected. That's something that we will take steps to stop immediately. And we've taken those steps. If it's necessary, we can take those steps. 55% of college students involved in clubs, teams, and organizations were victims of hazing. Females who have a history of sexual victimization are at the highest risk of being assaulted again. And I would say people who have a history of sexual victimization are at the highest risk of being assaulted again during their college years. And freshmen, first-year students, new students are particularly vulnerable because of their status as new students, new people in the environment. We got to talk about consent. Let's see, yeah, there we go. The Pennsylvania Department of Education just sent us a letter. Actually, this summer, in July, the governor of Pennsylvania wrote into law that we need to talk about consent. Well, we have been talking about consent. But just so you guys are clear, they feel like it's important. Schools around the country don't often talk about consent. Now, in Pennsylvania, we don't actually have a consent law. We don't have a definition of consent. But the law that was just written into law states that educational institutions need to educate their students about what consent is and what it isn't. Long time ago, when I was an RD in Kristen Hall, I was in Loescher for 20 years, so that tells you how long ago it was. There was a student, he wasn't in my dorm, but he went on a date with a young lady, and things got physical, and they both were willing participants in the activity that was going on. But I think at some point she had made a commitment that there was only a certain place that she would go, and beyond that she wouldn't go. When they got to that point, she said no. He didn't listen. That's a violation of consent. So what happened after the no was date rape. Both great kids, great students, great people, put themselves in a bad situation. Things got out of hand. He found himself on the wrong side of the law. So here's some things you need to understand about consent. You must obtain consent. Now, you don't have to do any of these things. But the reality is that when you don't, you put yourself at risk because there's always an opportunity for misunderstanding. What you perceive as let's go can actually be, from the other person's perspective, that's enough. So it's fundamental to any kind of sexual activity under the law, and you must obtain consent. That requires communication. We'll summarize that, but that requires communication. Verbal communication before engaging in any sexual activity clarifies consent. Now, I understand that in a school like ours and what we're about, you're not supposed to be engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. But we're not naive. It happens. So here is a place that students do go. And when you go there, if you go there, we hope you don't go there, here's things that you need to be concerned about. Verbal communication before engaging any activity, discussion of needs, limitations, provides a basis for a positive experience. It's affirmative. You need a clear, positive agreement. None of the following things means yes. The absence of a no or silence doesn't mean yes. Silence might mean I'm uncomfortable. I'm really uncomfortable. Please stop. Especially for a person who's been victimized before, because they have a tendency to shut down. And a shutdown doesn't mean that they're a willing participant. Body language alone without words doesn't mean yes. Flirtation doesn't mean yes. Marital status or relationship status, because you're dating, doesn't mean yes. Real or perceived power or authority doesn't mean yes. Because someone is dressed a certain way doesn't mean yes. A person's past conduct and behavior, what they've done in the past, doesn't mean they're willing to do it today. That doesn't mean yes. It must be voluntary, freely given, willingly. May not be valid if the person is subjected to emotional or psychological pressure, coercion, intimidation, or fear. So if a person is being pressured into a sexual experience, then that's not consent. A person cannot be incapacitated in any way, asleep, mentally incapacitated through the effect of drugs or alcohol or for any other reason, whether they've taken the drugs or alcohol willingly or not willingly, doesn't give a right for someone to take advantage. What happens in colleges all across America and probably all across the world is right here. Let's just provide more alcohol and more alcohol for the person. And, the more you drink, the less you're able to clearly think about how much you've had. And the less you're able to clearly think about how much you have, the more you may wind up having, and you may find yourself in a situation where you're more intoxicated than you thought you were. If a person is incapacitated, then they can't give consent under the law. Using drugs or alcohol can seriously interfere with the person who's initiating the sexual contact and their judgment about whether consent was sought or given. I was drunk is not a legal excuse for not obtaining clear consent. In my position and in the world in which we live, I deal with the case studies, the situations where this happens. I had a few too many, and I didn't know what I was doing, and the next thing you know, I had a few too many, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I don't even remember. All I know is there's evidence that somebody took advantage of me. I know who I was with. I know something happened. Not something I ever wanted to happen. And that happens over and over and over and over and over again on college campuses. Beyond college, let me just mention, businessmen go to places, you know what happens in Vegas, stay in Vegas, all that stuff. They go on these business trips alone, and they meet somebody, and their goal is to get them drunk enough that they can't remember what happened, and their credit cards are missing, their money's missing, their bank accounts are drained. Happens all the time. Consent is not permanent. Because consent was given today doesn't mean it's given in the future. It can be withdrawn at any time. Consent is autonomous. In other words, because of a past relationship or a present relationship doesn't mean that you have consent. It's not valid when the person holds authority over the other person. So, school teacher in high school and a student, because the student is willing, that's not valid under the law. A boss, a teacher, a coach, you can fill in all the blanks of all those authority and power positions. That's not consent. Sexual contact without consent is sexual assault. It's a crime. In summary, there has to be a yes. Make sure that the yes means yes. Keep the conversation open and going, and ongoing. Equality between persons is an important aspect of what consent is all about. Sexual contact without consent is a crime. We got to define sex, because our culture has this dumb idea that sex is only intercourse. Sexual activity is beyond intercourse. Touching a person in a sexual way is sex. Engaging in sexual activity outside of traditional intercourse is still sex. Now, we're created as sexual beings, and sex was created for our pleasure, but within the context of marriage. So when we take what God has designed and use it outside of where and how God's designed it, not only is it a sin, but it can be criminal. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 1, this is the will of God, your sanctification, that is, your being made more and more like Jesus Christ, made more holy, namely that you abstain from sexual immorality. Because sex is designed for marriage, and marriage is designed to be a picture of Christ's relationship to his church and his passionate love for the church, that they may be one. That oneness in sexuality, that bond in sexuality, is a picture of the bond that we have with Christ. And so to take that bond and use it in other ways is why it's sin. Oral sex is sex, anal sex is sex. There's a greater, higher risk of STIs, sexually transmitted infections. And those are things that you do need to be concerned about as you engage in sexuality outside of marriage, especially with people that you don't know. The world calls that high-risk behavior because you don't know who that person slept with last, and you don't know who they slept with, that person slept with, and you could be part of a chain of infection. It's a high-risk behavior. The more sexual partners you have, the world tells you that's cool, that's fun, that's great, that's exciting, that's normal. But the world doesn't tell you about some of the potential consequences of that. Multiple sex partners are high-risk behaviors. Having sex with someone you don't know, not knowing their character, not knowing their history. Maybe you've seen the commercials where somebody shows up at somebody's house and all the people they've dated are standing behind them. It's a high-risk behavior. It's what they're trying to communicate. My best friend for a while was we got our master's degrees in counseling together, and he went on to work in a hospital. He got his master's in social work, and he worked in a hospital. And it was his job in the hospital to inform people that they had HIV. They'd been tested, routine blood tests often, and it comes up, and it was his job to inform them. And these are the days when HIV was a death sentence. And most of those people were not engaging in high-risk behaviors, but their partners were. One of my close friends who I met at church, we both came here. She and her husband met here. They were both from my church. Yeah, I did their wedding. She found out one day that her husband was gay. And he'd had multiple partners. She was very fortunate that she didn't have an STI. He was in the hospital. She found out when he was in the hospital and he was dying. Unplanned pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, hepatitis, HPV virus, cancers, which leads to cancers, HIV and AIDS are some of the consequences of high-risk sex. Now, just so you know, I know you won't believe me when I tell you. I've talked to students who call people and they meet in the park for sexual experiences. Happens. It's dangerous. Obviously, drugs and alcohol facilitate sexual violence, so we got to talk about that as well. You should know that 26% of hazing, 50 to 75% of all sexual assaults on college campuses involve the use of alcohol. Alcohol is the drug of choice. It's the drug that's used most often by those who carry out sexual violence. The choice to consume alcohol is not the same as choosing to engage in sexual behavior. The choice to consume alcohol does place you in a vulnerable position. Now, I want you to hear me clearly. The choice to consume alcohol places you in a vulnerable position in the presence of someone who may want to take advantage of you. That does not mean that sexual violence that happens to you is your fault. It's never, ever your fault. If you surround yourself with people of integrity, even if you are in a vulnerable position, they ought to treat you with care. That's what you ought to have. That doesn't always happen. I went for some training down in at Kutztown University a few years ago, and they told us a story. Actually, they had some actors act out a story of a guy and a girl. And this kind of thing happened where he consumed some alcohol, she consumed some alcohol, she wound up passing out, and he was trying to be a gentleman. He really liked her. He really wanted to be involved with her. This was not a Christian school by any means. He wanted to be involved with her. But he wasn't going to do anything like that. He was going to take care of her. So she was drunk. She was not under control. So he took her upstairs to a room, put her on the bed, and he sat at the foot of the bed on the floor and started watching TV. She passed out. She woke up and came on to him. She woke up and gave verbal words that sound like consent. They wound up having sex. She passed out again. In the middle, afterwards. She was intoxicated. She didn't know what choices she was making. She didn't know what decisions she was making. She would have never had sex with him outside of the context of the fact that she was totally not under control, blacking out, passing out, coming back and not really remembering any of it. We talked about that situation because from a legal perspective, on the one side, the guy's guilty of not obtaining legal consent. We talked about it from the other side because she was not really legally able to give consent. So did he commit a crime? Yeah. Did she commit a crime? Yeah. You know what that makes it? A tragedy. Two people hurt. Both people hurt because of their use of and consumption of alcohol. Alcohol is never an excuse, nor does it place the blame on the victim. One of the I only know a fancy word for it, pernicious. The most evil things about taking advantage of someone else sexually is that the victim often blames himself. 9 times out of 10, the victim blames himself. And that blame and that guilt and that shame is as bad or worse than what happened to them in terms of the effect on their life moving forward. So understand that because these things happen, and often victimizers will blame the victim. They will tell them you wanted it. They will tell them that you seduced them. They will tell them that somehow this was a situation that you created. You're the evil person. 2008, 11,000 students were surveyed. 20 to 40% of people involved in clubs in college, 75% of those involved in teams, 73% involved in Greek organizations experienced hazing, and alcohol was a big part of those hazing experiences, and sex acts were a part of those experiences. Sexual violence is never, ever your fault. It is used both intentionally and unintentionally to weaken or extinguish the judgment of the victim. It's used intentionally and unintentionally to weaken the inhibitions of people who then perpetrate sexual violence. And it's just a tragedy. Alcohol can increase expectations of those who consume it, sexual expectations. It's mistakenly used by people who think that that's a means of taking advantage. And then victims who use alcohol may be blamed or blame themselves, as I said. Alcohol is the most frequent means by which date rape drugs are introduced. And these drugs allow you to be controlled by others, erases any memory of what took place while you're under their influence. The big story is Bill Cosby, if you know who he is. Famous comedian, used quaaludes in alcohol, interns, people who wanted opportunities in the entertainment business. He'd have meetings with them. He'd give them a drink. They'd lose consciousness. Or they'd lose control of their body so that they couldn't say anything, but they were aware of what happened. And there was victim, what was the last total, 40, something like that, victims? Same scenario over and over and over again. People think they can get away with it because often it erases memory, but not always. The goal of those who use date rape drugs is to render the victim extremely vulnerable, unable to give consent or say no, unable to remember what happened, or unable to remember clearly what happened, and unable to move or fight off unwanted sexual contact, can cause extreme drowsiness, memory loss, loss of control of your body, inability to move. It can produce a relaxing high, but leaves you confused, unable to remember what happened. They're odorless, they're colorless, they're tasteless. They come in liquid or powder form. They can be slipped into any kind of beverage or food. They can be added to joints, cigarettes, vaping liquids. And again, the consequences can be devastating. So we talked about all those things. Now we need to talk about the people who can help if those things happen. All of our faculty and staff, except for a couple of people, are mandated reporters, meaning if you disclose to them, they're under obligation to report that, especially if something happened here. Why? Because it's our responsibility to keep everyone safe. And if there's someone taking advantage, often, usually, well over 90% of the time, that person is not the first person, and they won't be the last. So, staff, faculty, employees, coaches, many of our office and student development have been trained to help you or to help you find the help that you need. We also have staff that are called victim advocates that have been more specially trained to make themselves available to help you and assist you in times of need. You can talk to Summer Kinder, you can talk to Dr. Forns. She's on the 3rd floor. She's the clinical director of the Foundation's Counseling Center. Marilyn Luster, who works with student employment. I am the Title IX coordinator, so I'm the person that's responsible to coordinate all of our efforts to help you be safe in this environment, and if something does happen, to immediately deal with those things, and also to work to make sure that that kind of thing, whatever it is, doesn't happen again. All those things are our responsibility, and mine in particular. Mike Schau, the athletic director, Nate Muhort, RD in Bancroft Hall, these people have some training to help in these kinds of circumstances. If you've been sexually assaulted, remember it's never your fault. Don't blame yourself. Once you're in a safe place, find someone who can help you. And there's a variety of people who can help you, including the deans. There's the number for the South Abington Police. You always are within your rights to call the police, and you are free to do that. A crime has taken place. God has established government, and I know right now we don't trust the government, we don't like our government, it's not popular, but you know what? Whether it's popular or not, the Bible still has something to say to us about our relationship to the government. It's established by God. Even if you didn't vote for it, God's in control, and he put that person in control. Believe me. Daniel didn't want Nebuchadnezzar to be the emperor, to be the authority over him. But that was the reality, and he was put there by God. And he had a responsibility to conduct himself in a God-honoring way. He didn't, but he still had that responsibility. And the government has been established to administer justice and reward those who do good. So the police are there to help in that process. And although this is one of the safest places to live in America, these things do go on, not only sometimes here on campus, in this environment, in this culture, in this campus community, but also outside of this campus community. And you don't hear about it. You know why you don't hear about it? Because it's none of your business. That's why. It's confidential, but it does happen. And they're experienced at working with people, working with high school students, working with college students to bring about justice, bring about safety for the people involved. There's a number for campus security. A long time ago, there was a guy who came with a church as a volunteer for one of our camps, sports camps, and he wound up sexually assaulting some very young boys. They were barely supposed to be here age. And they were very sheltered and very naive, and he took advantage of them. And we dealt with the police, and it was great. And that person paid the price for that. Served some jail time, all that. Found out that had happened back home at his church. It had happened in this community because he was involved in the youth ministry in one of the local churches in the area. A few years later, those kids graduated high school. Some of them came to college, and they were in my dorm. Not the ones we knew about, but the ones we didn't know about. Not the ones from that year, but the ones from the year before. And the year before that. Shame often keeps people from stepping forward and saying something because they feel like it's their fault. But God's established one of the more healing things you can do is experience justice. To have the people in authority stand up and say, you know what? That was wrong. What happened to you was wrong. It was not your fault. Because you were naive, because no one told you about sex and you didn't know what was happening with sex, doesn't mean it was your fault. Here's our confidential people who you can talk to who will not share that with anybody else, and that would be Dr. Ken Pine from the seminary, Dr. Forns, and they're right on that, in that same hallway. And then also on campus, we have a third party, an outside organization that provides counseling services for students in exchange for free rent, okay? So we get a certain amount of counseling hours per year, and they don't report to us. You can go to the counseling center and get help, and they don't tell us anything, so it can be very confidential. So those are people who are not mandated reporters. Everyone else is, and you can tell them whatever you need to tell them, and they can help you. There's a lot more information on our website. On the Title IX page, there's actually a booklet, a Title IX booklet that gives you more information if you're interested in that, or if you have concerns and want more information, that's a place you can go. There's also a complaint form there where you can file a formal complaint. That complaint can be anonymous, or you can put your name on it. Now, understand, if you don't put your name on it, then that limits what we can do in terms of investigating it. All right? So one of the things that we have a responsibility is to keep everybody safe. And if someone is taking advantage of students and we don't know who you are, then we're limited as to what we can do. Knowing who you are means we can talk to you and get more information. Knowing who you are means we can find out more about that person and the circumstances and the situations and where it happens. Before we're done, I just want to make mention, again, although it's not your fault, there are things you can do to keep yourself safe. We have very nice campus here, but there are places on this campus that you can go that are potentially dangerous. So walking around the pond, especially on the dark side where there's no lights, after dark, by yourself, male or female, that can be a potentially dangerous situation. The community lives right there, right? And anyone can come to the Catholic organization parking lot on the other side, perpetrate a crime in the woods, and be gone, and no one will ever know. So I want you to know that there's places that you ought not to go after dark. There's no rule, but it might be wise. If something happens to you, now you ought to be able to go there, right? You ought to be safe, but we live in a fallen world. But that doesn't always happen. There's more information about if you have been sexually assaulted, preserving evidence. That's on the website in that booklet. I'll leave that for you guys to look at. But just know that it's important if something has happened for you to preserve as much evidence as possible. You will feel dirty, and you will want to get clean. But you may be destroying the very evidence needed to bring justice to that person. So be careful about that. Read that information. It'd be really helpful, because if they can retrieve DNA, that really goes a long way. Otherwise, it's just your word against theirs, and that's more challenging. I think that's all I'm going to say. We talked about all those things. Confidentiality is our promise to you. We have a number of different ways that we interact with students in crisis, in difficulty, and it is our commitment to one another and to you to have confidentiality. It's nobody else's business. If you want to tell it, you can tell it, but it's not our job to tell it. Every time we meet, it's the first thing we talk about, confidentiality. It's important to us because it's important to you. There have been incidents that have happened on our campus, not a ton. The first 3 that happened were false reports, false accusations, but we investigated them and found them to be false. But that was a good education for all of us, not to jump to conclusions, not to make assumptions, to let an investigation run its course and treat everyone fairly, the person who's accused and the person who's making the accusation, because sometimes it's not what it seems to be. I hope and pray that none of you have to experience any of this. We work every day to make sure that none of you experience any of this. But it can happen. And know that if it happens, there are people who are caring and concerned and want to help you. Let me pray, and you can be dismissed. Gracious God, thank you again for CSU and for these students and our opportunity to have an impact in their lives. And even in the midst of what might be a horrible circumstance, We pray that we might be able to move in and help and assist, bring about justice, bring about a situation where those things won't happen again. And I pray for safety for each one of us. But if God, you allow those things to happen, I pray that we would act with integrity